go. What?
Welcome to the second meeting of the Unemployment Insurance Study Committee. Today is October 19th. This is room 10. Mike, I would love if you would leave that door open despite the noise so that the air can move. We do not get the COVID. Thank you. We have a big agenda before us, and before we jump into it, I would also like to acknowledge something that I think we started last month's meeting with, which is that this committee has just 3 meetings in its legislative purview right now, and that the issue of unemployment over the last 2 years has been overwhelming and difficult and a major challenge for both state government and all the Vermonters who have tried to access the unemployment insurance system. And this committee's purview is limited to benefit provision, meaning the amount of benefits that are provided, trust fund sufficiency, issues around penalty weeks and reimbursable employers. And there are other areas of legislative work that are more focused on the day-to-day operations.
Join the meeting.
Unemployment insurance. And so we are expecting a report around issues of adjudication and fraud later this year. We are looking at issues of misclassification with the Attorney General. And so there are other places that this same conversation is happening. It can't all happen here, which I think sometimes feels hard for all of us because we know that Vermonters want us to talk about all of those things. So today, we're going to spend the morning talking about trust fund sufficiency and benefit provision. For the morning, we're going to talk about more immediate issues of benefits provision in the trust fund. And then from 10:30 on, we're going to talk about longer term opportunities. So we know that we have $100 million that was supposed to go out over the next 10 years based on legislation we passed in the spring. We know that it was not able to go out in the manner that we originally intended it, with an additional $25 per beneficiary. And so we're looking at other ways that we can send it out. And so Joyce has modeled out a variety of scenarios to see what it looks like if we essentially raise the minimum and raise the maximum and take us through that situation. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning. It's from all reports on numerous committees, it is the only mechanical option that our unemployment insurance system is capable of at this point. So that's what we are hoping to do to get more benefits to Vermonters. Take it away, Joyce.
Thank you very much. Good morning. For the record, I'm Joyce Manchester from the Joint Fiscal Office, and I have tried to answer a number of questions. I'm now going to try to share my screen.
You succeeded.
Get it on full screen.
Joyce, did you want to share your PowerPoint?
Yes.
That help?
Out there.
No.
Why didn't you
Let's stop share. Let's stop share. Share screen. There we go.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with answering some questions from last time. So there are a number of questions about the pattern of solvency of the UI Trust Fund in Vermont, and also questions about other states and their average high cost multiple and how they possibly could see an increase in the average high cost multiple during times of COVID. So we're going to start there and then we'll move into the modeling the extra, the higher minimum benefits. So here's a picture of the UI trust fund balance in Vermont. The blue line on the lower line is current dollars. So for example, in 2003, the balance was about $260,000 in 2003 dollars. And then the orange line shows what happens when you adjust for inflation. So that would increase the dollars in today's dollars up to about 400,000 in 2003. So you can see that coming out of the recession of 2000, 2001, the balance was pretty high, and then it slowly got lower until we hit the recession of 2008, 2007, 2008, 2009, and then it really plummeted. And then we got into the borrowing situation and slowly recovered after 2014 or so, and then saw quite a rapid increase in the UI trust fund balance until we hit the COVID recession in 2020, and then once again a plummet. So that's just the balance. And now we want to move on to talking about the average.
Sure, so excuse me. Please. Is this supposed to be really, that's the balance, 300, is it million or 100,000s?
I'm sorry, it's in thousands. Yes,
That's, all.
So that's 300 million.
yes, I'm sorry, yes.
okay, it's millions, that's what I thought, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that, I should have labeled thousands. Yes, indeed. Okay.
Could I just follow up, because this chart is helpful. Could you remind us what we think of as like a sensible target? I don't think there's an ideal one, but.
Sure, so the US Department of Labor says that they would like to see an average high cost multiple, which we'll get to in just a minute, between 1 and 1.2. And we're going to look at that, a similar graph that shows the average high cost multiple in just a minute. So remember, the average high cost multiple is just the trust fund balance relative to or divided by the average of the 3 highest benefit amounts paid. So you're basically looking at recession times, how much in benefits you pay out.
And those are quarters, 3 highest quarters?
It's 3 high, no, it's years.
Okay,
It's years.
thank you.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that they exclude the reimbursable employer benefits because, of course, those come out of the trust fund, but then they come back in because the reimbursable employers have to reimburse the trust fund for those benefits. Okay. So, and here I said U.S. Department of Labor prefers HCM be greater than or equal to 1. And in something that I saw, it says that they really prefer it to be between 1 and 1.2 at least. So that's that. And in case anybody wants all the gory numbers, quarter by quarter from 2002 and 21 second quarter, I've shown you those numbers on this slide. But you can see that as of 2021 quarter 1, the average high cost multiple in Vermont has dropped to 1.06. So we are down close to the dangerous limit. You can also see during the time 2010 to 2013, they're reporting the average high cost multiple as 0, but that's when we were borrowing from the feds. So they just don't report the multiple when you're in borrowing status. And they started reporting.
Sorry, Joyce, just out of curiosity, why do we see this sort of mogul shape?
Oh, yes. So there's that, are you looking at the average high cost multiple?
Well, I'm looking, yes, but I just noticed the
Yeah.
very distinct and consistent shape.
Right, so there are 4 quarters that are shown here for the data. And it turns out that I think it's the January, the first quarter average high cost multiple tends to be low, and then it rises during the summer, and then it falls again when you get down to the next.
So that sort of reflects our seasonal
It's just the
employment.
seasonal. It has to do with both benefits going up, but also when the feds pay the trust fund, reimburse the trust fund for their costs and so forth. So, yeah, it's quite noticeable that every year you see that hump.
I believe that our council is interested in adding to this conversation. I'm not sure how we can do that in a way that,
You can sit here if you want.
Sure, I'll move to the table so that,
okay,
for the record, Damian Leonard, Legislative Counsel. Just one other note to add to that is the majority of tax collections occur at the end of the first quarter every year because of the taxable wage base. And once you've hit that taxable wage base, you don't pay anymore. So everyone's paying full taxes in the first quarter and then it tapers off, which would also help. So that by the time you get to Q4 and Q1, you see that lowest numbers and then you get a big collection and you spike again. So that's just part of the structure of the law. We don't spread it out over the year. It's front loaded for all the employers.
Thank you.
thank you.
Good, thanks. So the figure that shows the average high cost multiple per month is sort of interesting in that I've marked the recession periods with a gray box. So you can see how much the average high cost multiple is dropping during those recessions. So from 2008 to 2009 and again in 2020. I've also marked in an orange box the period when Vermont had the very highest or the second highest average high cost multiple in the country, all states. So going into the 2020 recession, Vermont was at the top of the heap in terms of its average high cost multiple. But then how quickly we fell. So, right, so that's the way the average high cost multiple looks over the past almost 20 years since it's.
And the formula that we're using now for people to pay in, can someone remind me what year that we moved to that new formula?
Oh, for tax collection?
Mhm, for tax collection.
2020?
No. I guess the last grand bargain would be the easiest way for me to describe that. What year was that?
That was in 2010.
Thank you. Okay.
So
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. There was a question from the previous meeting. How did some states increase their average high cost multiple during the pandemic? And I thought it might have something to do with their very low unemployment rates or a change in their tax schedules or something. It turned out to be very simple. It is the case that each of the 4 states, Maine, Idaho, North Dakota, and South Carolina, paid in large sums from their coronavirus relief funds. So that was money that went directly into the unemployment insurance trust fund to use those funds. Good.
Thank you.
In case you are interested, here's a short table that shows you trust fund solvency and the average high cost multiple for the states that are now, I should say for the states that are in pretty good shape in terms of their average high cost multiple as of January 1st, 2021. So you can see Maine, Idaho, North Dakota, South Carolina, all at the top with average high cost multiples greater than 1. Those are the 4 states that put in coronavirus relief funds. And you can see in lighter orange, the states that have a better average high cost multiple than Vermont as of January 1st, 2021. So generally speaking, they had a smaller drop, in their average high cost multiple than Vermont has had.
Joyce, do you know in your research whether any other state reduced contributions like we did last year?
I do not know.
Thank you.
I do not know.
I don't know off the top of my head.
If people are happy with that, we can move on to raising the minimum on insurance.
Thank you. I think we're going to come back to this.
So the current minimum benefit is based on the lowest earnings possible that results in eligibility for UI. I wrote here that the current minimum benefit is about 75 per week. That's a little bit outdated. It's closer to 80 or $85 per week now. And certainly when you look at data showing the distribution of benefits received per week in the second half of 2020, you see that the lowest benefit paid was between $81 and $85. So that seems to be the minimum as of second half of 2020. So the question for me was, how much would the minimum benefit have to rise to cause an additional cost of about 100 million over 10 years, or about $10 million per year? Okay, so that was the question that I was looking at. Before we get to modeling, we need to address the feasibility question. Is it possible or feasible to raise the minimum UI benefit? So the commissioner said a few months ago he thought changing the minimum benefit could be done. So I pestered Vermont Department of Labor about this, and here's their response via email on October 14th. They said, in theory, it is possible to establish a minimum UI weekly benefit amount. However, the department would urge caution when considering changes to the current mainframe system. We have never established a minimum benefit amount, and there may be unforeseen issues associated with this work. We would also need to fully vet this possibility with the U.S. Department of Labor. Okay, something to keep in mind. I did receive the distribution of UI recipients by weekly benefit amount. The distribution shows the number of UI recipients during a specified period who received weekly benefits of a specific amount. And it turns out those are in $5 intervals. So 81 to 85, 86 to 90, 91 to 95, and so forth. Originally, I received data for the second half of 2020. Just late Friday, I received data for the first and second halves of 2018. By then, I had done all the modeling, I had done all the slides, so I have not updated my estimates. So today's estimates are based on the second half of 2020. Remember, that's during the pandemic. We going into this, I did not know if the distribution by benefit amount would be different during the pandemic than prior to the pandemic. I can show you what that looks like later on. Also, please note that I'm sticking with $20. So inflation between 2018, I'm sorry, inflation between 2020 and today has been what, 6 or 8%. The question is, how would I translate the distribution to today's dollar? Because I have intervals, I don't have exact amounts. Okay, so that's to be worked on going forward. You could also argue that I might want to increase the benefit amount by the growth in the average weekly wage rather than just inflation, because we know that wages may be growing faster than inflation because of labor shortages, because of demand for labor, However, when you think about who's at the low end of unemployment insurance benefits, they may or may not be seeing a big increase in average wages. So that's a question out there that has to be resolved. Okay, so this is the picture of the distribution that I received. So this is, again, a snapshot of the second half of 2020. These are unique individuals. So when they came into the system, how much did they qualify for in terms of a weekly benefit amount? The total number of recipients, 11,402. Now, let's see, you can see there's a bump at 0. There are almost 500 people who are receiving 0 benefits. Now, these are people who are eligible for UI insurance, but for whatever reason, their benefit paid out is 0. So they could have been in overpayment status and now that's being recouped. They could be in penalty weeks, so they're waiting until they finish their penalty weeks before they receive a dollar amount. They could have earnings in a part-time job that offset their unemployment insurance benefits. So 50% of your earnings in another job are used to offset your benefit amount.
So also in this period, there was the federal bump.
Yes, so
So
that's not shown here.
I
These are-
appreciate that, but I guess I'm wondering if that meant that people who wouldn't normally bother to show up wouldn't have applied because they weren't going to be eligible or whatever. Suddenly they were very motivated to apply in this phase, in this period, right?
Yes, so you've anticipated one of my points for later on. That's called induced entry, when people see
Okay.
that the benefit is more lucrative, and so they are induced to apply. So there's been some research on this. Iona Marinescu is a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania who's done a lot of good stuff on this. It looks like the evidence is mixed. It's really hard to see that more people are applying. The way she looks at it is, how hard are they trying to find a job?
Right.
So the evidence is mixed. You could argue it either way, but it's not clear. So we'll see that a bit later. Sure.
Yeah.
So following up on Senator Pearson's question, so these numbers do not include the $600 or the $300. But my understanding is that those $600 and $300 went out in the same check as the underlying thing, but the department was able to segregate what was the weekly benefit amount from the supplement.
Right, so this is the state, I was going to say state paid benefit. This is state funded benefit, I guess.
Okay.
So it was calculated at the time of eligibility.
Okay, thank you.
And you will notice that the maximum benefit, the big spike, almost more than 35, maybe 3,700 people are at the maximum benefit of $506. Now, in fact, the actual maximum benefit in 2020 in the second half was $531. And I was told that the programming simply wasn't updated when the report was run. So this is not quite the actual spike at the maximum benefit. And I have adjusted for that. We'll see that in just a minute. Okay, now the middle part of that distribution was really hard to see in the prior figure. So this just shows the distribution of UI claims by weekly benefit amount if I exclude the zeros and the maximum, just so that you can see how things move. And I've highlighted the 340 line, 336 to 340 line, because 340 is going to turn out to be the amount that we have to increase the minimum benefit to in order to spend almost $10 million a year. So we'll be seeing that number quite a lot. So you can see very few people at the very, very low end below, let's say 135 or so. And I was surprised that it was relatively flat across most of the middle of the distribution there.
What percentage of the folks are at the max versus in this middle?
We're going to get there.
Great.
I promise.
I will be patient. Thank you.
Okay, so I've said much of this already. 482 individuals out of 11,402 received zero benefits. That was something like 4.2%. 3,736 of the maximum amount. The actual maximum was 531. So what I did was to extend the distribution to 531, and I targeted 27.5% of individuals to be at the 531, the actual maximum. And that's the same percentage of people who are at the maximum in 2019. Now, again, I don't know that that's right, because of course, pandemic distribution could be different from more normal times, but when you think about what I'm modeling a more normal time going forward. So that's what I had in my head. Okay, now I would like to take a few minutes to talk briefly about the share of UI recipients who receive the maximum benefit. There's been some discussion of that. So I went back to look at the historical data, and you can see in the figure, the share of UI recipients entitled to the maximum weekly benefit amount from 2000 to 2019 has varied a lot. It was much higher in the early 2000s, and it has dropped since then. The average was something like 26%. The The share at the maximum in 2019 was 27.5%. So I decided to go with the share in 2019, although I could be convinced to use the average over the entire time period. It's not that much different. Okay, but that's what it looks like.
I'd be curious if, does that reflect like the kinds of jobs that we're seeing layoffs at different periods?
It very much could, yeah, for sure. So let's see if I remember my recessions. After the 2000 recession, which was a
It's kind of a,
construction recession,
oh, I thought that was a tech bubble.
2000.
Might have been an IBM layoff.
I'm trying to think, that was
Like a long time ago.
very early in my career. I don't think.
That's okay.
But yes, you're right. I think, yeah. The earnings levels of the people who are on unemployment insurance will determine their benefits and will determine the share of people on at the maximum, right? Okay, so here is a cumulative distribution. Okay, so that's a big word, but it just means that I've taken the shares of people at every interval of weekly benefit amounts, and I've added them up so that I can show you that about 40%, almost 40% of individuals receiving UI benefits, 340 per week or less in the second half of 2020, okay? So the share at the very top, I've targeted, as I said, to be 27.5%, and that defines where that bend point is at the very end with the circle around it.
Joyce, it would help me to understand what the $340 and what the maximum, all these numbers translates into for the typical Vermont worker's wages. Let's assume they're working 52 weeks a year and then they get laid off and their wages are steady. That's the classic example of somebody on this program. What does, I guess I could do the math, but going backwards, what does 340 equal in terms of someone who has level earnings who gets laid off? What are they making before they get the 340?
Right, so I'm going to come to this. So I've got a nice table that shows you the benefit amount and the implied weekly wage.
The what rate?
The implied weekly wage. So we know that the benefit is 57% of their wage.
Right.
So I'll show you the
Okay.
table. I think it's coming up pretty soon.
Okay, great.
I challenge us to come up with a question that you don't have a future slide.
Oh,
Okay.
all right. Okay, so here I'm telling you a little bit about how I did the exercise to figure out how much to raise the minimum benefit in order to cost the system about 10 million per year. So if you think about the worker who previously received a UI check of $83 per week, so this is the low man on the totem pole, right? Using a wage replacement rate of 57%, the implied weekly wage is about $146 a week, okay? If that was the earnings, then the benefit would be about $83 a week. And so raising the benefit to 340 would cost $257 to the system each week. And then the one interesting thing that comes out of this is that the new minimum benefit would be about 2.3 times the worker's weekly wage. So this is where you worry about induced entry, because you could get so much more on unemployment insurance than you were getting on your job, right? Okay, and now as a second example, consider the worker who previously received a UI check of $153 per week. So that person's weekly wage would have been about $268. So that cost the system $187 more per week. And the new minimum benefit would be about 1.27 times the worker's weekly wage. So that's within the range of equivalency or similarity, I guess I should say. So that's how I did it. I simply added up the number of workers at each level, the additional cost to the system, all the way through until I came up with a cost that was something less than 10 million, something less because I know that these are $20. I'm gonna be moving forward to use more current dollars in the next more refined round of this exercise.
Joyce, I'm thinking about Senator Pearson's question about sort of who was impacted by each of the recessions and the idea that service workers were laid off very much in particular. I don't like calling COVID a recession. I think it confuses the issue a little bit, but and I very much think I should know the answer to this question, but I don't. For tipped workers, does their UI match their declared earnings, or is it just their hourly wage?
I hope it's.
And I think that's probably a question for Mr. Leonard over there, sorry.
So that gets a little bit complicated
Great.
because there's the issue of how much of your earnings are you actually reporting.
And for reporting, yes.
So, but let me go right over to the definition of wages for purposes of unemployment, and that way we'll all be on the same page.
And while
It's
you
got to be declared.
go there, I think, when I was waiting table 20 years ago, there was cash, and now most people pay with credit cards, so it's pretty hard not to declare your tipped wages.
Right. So wages includes all remuneration paid for services, including commissions and bonuses, and the cash value of any remuneration paid in a medium other than cash. Gratuities received by an individual in the course of employment from persons other than the individual's employer and reported by the individual to the individual's employer shall be treated as wages. So that's the key. It has to be reported. So to the extent you get cash tips that you don't report, those won't go into your unemployment check. So, but to the extent that it's going on a credit card or into a tip pool, and then it goes through your employer and is reported, that would all be included.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good. Okay, this is simply a picture showing you how I extended the distribution to show the actual maximum weekly benefit of $531 in 2020. And I basically kept the same shares going in the higher weekly benefit amounts. And I targeted the 27.5% as the maximum. So if I add up all of the additional costs, raising the minimum benefit to $340 a week, I get about $9.4 million. About 40% of UI recipients would receive increased benefits. As I indicated, UI benefits at the very low end would receive more than twice their implied weekly wage. About 10% of recipients would receive at least 25% more than their implied weekly wage. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And more than 15% would receive at least their weekly wage amount. So rather than 57%, which is now their UI benefit, they would receive at least 100% of their weekly wage amount.
And your 10% is exclusive of your 15%.
10% would it?
Because they all add up to 40.
No.
Okay.
No, 10% would receive at least 25% more.
Okay.
Right, 125%, and 15% would receive 100%, at least 100%.
And that 10% is a separate category of people than your 15%.
No. Let's go back to the graph. So actually, no, I'm going to have a better graph.
Great.
Question.
Okay.
Okay. Order of questions.
We'll rehearse next time.
Okay, and here's where I give you a reference on the induced entry if you're interested. It's interesting reading, but the bottom line is you can't really see strong evidence either way. There's no strong evidence that says no one was induced to enter. There's no strong evidence that says lots of people were induced to enter. So sort of stuck in the middle. Okay, this is simply a chart that shows implied weekly wages corresponding to each of the benefit levels. And I've targeted the orange circle to show the weekly benefit amount of $340, corresponding to the implied weekly wage of $593. You have a question about how, a benefit of $200 lines up, you can just look at the $200 current UI benefit point and see that it lines up to something like $350.
Technical issue.
No, I'm communicating with them.
Okay. Representative Marcotte, we're trying to bring you back up on the screen that I can see, but in the meantime, if you would make a noise so that your face pops back up when you do want to ask a question, that would be very helpful for me. I won't see your hand. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emily.
Back to you, Joyce.
Okay, and here I've simply added an orange line to show what the weekly benefit amounts would look like if we imposed a new minimum benefit of $340. So you can see all the people to the left of the orange circle would get higher benefits, right? And you can see there's a subset of people who would receive at least their wage, which is the sort of gray black circle, I guess maybe it's green. So that's where the wage is equal to $340. And anything to the left of that, they would be receiving more than their weekly wage. So maybe that chart helps. Further to the left, they would be receiving at least 125% of their weekly wage.
And so
So the 15% refers to all the people at what, $190 per week, maybe?
Right.
okay,
And
thanks.
the 10% would be 125%, so maybe that's close to 150, yeah, to the left. Okay, and here is the table that shows a lot. But if you see the weekly benefit amount is on the left, right? That's 81 to 85, all the way up to 226 to 230. You can read across to show that the frequency then adds up to the cumulative percentages, right? So by the time you get up to $230 a week, you're at 20.6% of people. Recipients. The new UI benefit per person I've shown as $340. I've stopped where this table ends at $230, but obviously it continues. The implied weekly wage corresponds to their old weekly benefit amount, but all the people in yellow had an implied weekly wage less than $340, so they would be getting more than their previous wages. And then to show how this works out in terms of weekly benefit as a share of the weekly wage, you can look at the final column. So here you can see that 10% of people corresponds to about $160 a week, 10.5% of people. And 15% of people is down at $195 per week, 15.5%. So that shows you how I got those percentages. And I now know that I should have numbered my slides, because then I can tell you I'm on page X. Next.
We haven't had that question yet.
Next time. Okay. Any questions on that table? That was meant to be helpful. I hope it's helpful.
Sure.
Okay, now here's the part where we talk about the distribution from 2018, which is closer to normal times, as compared to the distribution from the second half of 2020, which was during the big recession. So what I find is that if you look at the 2018 distribution, you find proportionally more recipients at lower weekly benefit amounts. And I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a minute. But that means that there would be more people below $340 a week And so my cost estimate may be low. More people would have to be raised up. Okay. So there's my picture. The gray line is the distribution from 2020, the second half that we've been using for the exercise. And you can see that that sits below the blue lines, which are for the first and second halves of 2018. We were not able to get distributions for 2019 because the Department of Labor did not have those reports run. Okay, so what I'm finding is that in the 2018 distribution, about 48% of people receive $340 or less. And we've got some different numbers going, different inflation adjusted numbers going on there. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but you get the idea that there might be more people at the low end if we used a more normal time distribution.
And we've seen from previous employment dips that generally the recovery is faster for higher paid workers.
True, true. Yes. Okay, I'm now going to move to combining an increase in the minimum benefit with raising the maximum benefit. So are we ready to move on to that?
Let's pause 1 second. Can you remind me, can you go back a few slides to the weekly amount, the one with the circles in the middle? Yep, that one, thank you. The percentage of folks between the two circles.
Okay, so that's answered if we look at that table.
Yep.
So remember, let's see if we can get the circles lined up. Oh dear, so unfortunately, okay, my table doesn't extend all the way to 340, but if we look at the people at the first circle on the left, that corresponds to their wage being less than 340. So that's the yellowish highlighted folks.
Yep.
And they represent about 15.5%. And we know that the number of people at 340 benefits per week or less is almost 40%. So the difference there is 25%. Okay.
Does anyone have any thoughts on or questions on the weekly minimums before we move to maximums and then try putting them together?
I guess I just have a question, trying to get a picture of the typical claimant that would benefit from a rise in the minimum. Is there any pattern of the number of weeks, number of hours that person might work a week?
I have no idea. That would be a question for the Department of Labor. I don't know if they have the answer or not. I don't know.
One of the things that's interesting about most unemployment insurance systems is that they don't track weekly.
Right.
They don't track hours.
Right.
They track total wages. And so even getting national data on that is remarkably difficult.
It's dollars per quarter that matter for eligibility and the benefit, right?
And so we don't have a sense of how many hours these folks worked compared to, or what their hourly wages were. We just know what their total take home pay was. Or
And that's why
declared
we
pay.
talk about implied.
Yes.
And when we're doing implied wages, that's assuming they're working full time.
So that's just taking their quarterly earnings and recognizing that the benefit is going to be 57% of whatever that quarterly earnings was.
Okay, right. So that's just quarterly, not hourly. I
So it's
got it.
quarterly, and then I've looked at the weekly amount, knowing that there are 13 weeks in a quarter.
So someone who worked 2 hours for $50 an hour is treated exactly the same as someone who
Yeah.
made $10 an hour and whatever the other end of that math is.
Yes, yes. Golly.
Here we are. Okay, now I'm thinking about raising the maximum benefit. So again, I asked the Department of Labor would it be possible to raise the maximum benefit? And here's their response. The maximum weekly benefit amount is altered each year as part of the annual determination process established in 21 VSA section 1338. That said, since the onset of the pandemic, the department has changed the maximum weekly benefit amount twice, and both times have resulted in significant improper payments to claimants. This is due to the lack of skilled staff with historical knowledge working on the UI system, along with the massive changes that were made to the system to manage the pandemic. Okay, again, just something.
Thanks, Joyce.
All right. Okay, so I assumed, maybe incorrectly, but I assumed that you would want to do the combination of raising the minimum and raising the maximum. So I was trying to think of some proportion that would be acceptable. And it seems to me you probably want to raise the minimum more than you want to raise the maximum because you want to help people at the lowest end. So I was surprised that in order to raise the maximum benefit to $600, remember we're starting from 531. So that's a $70 increase for everybody at the maximum. And of course, it would be different today because today the maximum is 581 and 583. But in any case, if you raise the maximum to 600 from 531, you also have to raise the minimum benefit to 325, which is pretty close to the full 340. But there's so many more people at the bottom and they get bumped up so much more, right? Okay. So the additional cost of this exercise is about 9.5 million. Again, it's under 10 million because of inflation and further adjustments maybe in the distribution. It would affect about 37% of UI recipients at the low end and about 27% at the high end. And again, you have the issue of induced entry perhaps at the high end, just like you did at the low end.
And
Yeah.
so that another way of looking at that is, does that add up to 64% would get a benefit, so therefore 36%
No.
do not. So we would be excluding this random middle third of recipients from any change. Okay.
Right.
Just
And
wanna
again,
make
this
sure I
is
have-
meant to be a short-term fix because given the time frame, we think we can only
Yeah,
maybe change the minimum and maximum. Right?
right. But short term for a decade. I mean,
Let's say 5 years, Senator Pearson.
yeah. All right. Thank you.
Senator Hawkins.
So on the note on Washington State,
Oh, we're not there yet, but yes, yes.
I'm just curious in terms of, maybe this is a question for Damien. Do other states, is this minimum in Washington State of $201, is that similar to the way we calculate the minimum, which, as I understand it, we don't really have a minimum, but in order to qualify for benefits, you have to have a benefit amount of $81 or something like that. Do they do the same thing, and do they, or are they putting money on top of what a person would otherwise qualify in the traditional formula?
So with Washington State, I believe the minimum is calculated separately. I'd have to look at their statute, but the way they compute their weekly benefit amount is they do 3.85% of your high 2 quarters in your base period. However, unlike us, they have the hourly hours work data at their disposal. So to qualify for a benefit, you have to have worked 680 hours. You don't have to, like with us, you have to have earned a certain amount in 1 quarter and then 40% of that amount spread over the other 3 quarters in your base period. They're able to look at, did you work 680 hours in your base period? If so, you qualify. I believe that's a statutorily set minimum that's separate. There are a handful of states that actually set a minimum. But I'd have to confirm by looking at their statute. Just a quick glance at the formula has me thinking that that is a statutorily set minimum, not like us where it's the minimum benefit you could earn if you meet the qualifying criteria. For most states, that ends up being something under $100 there. So if you look at the state benefits, just I did a handout on this earlier. You'll see for a lot of the states, the minimum benefit is like $30 or something like that. But then you'll see states where it goes up into the high hundreds and sometimes up over 200 like Washington State. And that's typically an instance where they've set the minimum as a percentage of their state average weekly wage or a fixed dollar amount. So
I guess what I'm after, the long and short is Washington State cutting off people by having a high minimum, or are they adding a greater percentage of wage replacement for low-income people than they are for the rest of the system?
So I think that they're offering those people a greater percentage of wage replacement. If you have a minimum, statutorily set minimum, you're going to have people who would otherwise qualify for benefit below that minimum or getting a greater percentage of wage replacement.
But didn't you say that they basically have a pretty high hourly requirement before you can you're even more? You said
680 hours. The full-time work is, I believe it's 2080 per year.
right.
So 680 hours works out to about an average of a little over 10 hours a week,
Right.
maybe 12 hours a week. So that's if you're looking back over a 4-quarter base period, that's not a whole lot. Even if you were to trim your base period down to half a year, you're still talking about half-time employment or better. So
That's more onerous than ours de facto, right? Because we're just on a, I mean, you don't have to make very much money really to be eligible in our system.
Well, can I
guess I'm asking that, but
ask a slightly more precise question?
Yeah, please.
So our current minimum for entry, what is if that was a 40-hour-a-week work week, what is the sort of weekly wages that would be associated with that?
yeah, I mean, that is.
I believe the current quarterly minimum earnings is close to $3,000. It's 29.
Yeah, it's 29 something.
$3,000 divided by 13 weeks means $230 a week,
Mhm.
divided by 20 hours, let's say.
Well, what's minimum wage again?
11.75.
Wage, that would be $11.54 per hour, you know, and minimum wage is now $11.75 per hour. So that's basically 20 hours a week,
at minimum wage.
a little more than 20 hours a week at minimum wage.
Thank you.
Okay, and I did one more exercise just to see how it would turn out. I wanted to raise the maximum benefit required to $625. That means that you would raise the minimum benefit just a little bit less to $318. The additional cost there is $9.6 million. 36% at the low end, 27% of recipients at the high end would get increased benefits. And there's the note about the Washington State minimums and maximum benefits. I think it was Massachusetts who also had a maximum benefit way up in the 800s. Yeah, their maximum is between $855 and $1282.
1282 includes the dependence allowance for Massachusetts.
Nice for them.
So that includes 63% of folks.
Yes. So that's as much as I've done in terms of modeling options, but I'm certainly open to your suggestions as to what would be helpful to model. And I would say at some point we ought to get the Department of Labor to help us. They may have more insights about how to go about this.
So just to remind, I guess it's a question for all of us. These are basically the variables you can play with, although we've seen in the email a plea not to, but they have changed. It is possible technically for us to do this, whereas say other ideas they've considered completely impossible.
I see Representative Marcotte's hand. Representative Marcotte?
Thanks, Emily. Think along with this thought, we want to make sure, well, I think we need to realize that the benefits are treated as wages. And what kind of implications does that have to lower end workers? That's my beeping. That's my gases. People are calling for gas. Sorry.
Okay,
What
thanks
implications?
for joining us.
What implications does that have, or could that have for people that are on SSI benefits that can only work a certain amount of hours a week and earn a certain amount of money? And same with people that are receiving other state benefits that would push them to the cliff. I think we need to realize that as well.
Yes, and I do have a slide coming up that shows you various benchmarks. So I should talk about that now. We should get there soon.
I think that would be helpful to go to soon because we can,
It's coming up.
great.
Possible benchmarks to use for the minimum UI benefit. Okay, and some of the benchmarks that I looked at are livable wage, poverty guidelines, so that's the federal poverty level. The SSDI, since it's the Social Security Disability Insurance, SGA, which means substantial gainful activity. So you can earn up to the SGA without losing your benefits. If you go over that amount, there is an offset so that you lose some of your benefits. And then I also looked at suggested changes in the minimum UI benefit amount from the Economic Policy Institute. These are Damien's references that turned out to be useful in this regard. So let's see how that turns out. Okay, so the 2020 livable wage comes from the Vermont Basic Needs Budget Report, which was last done in 2020. And it turns out that the livable wage for one working member of a two working member household. Okay, so this assumes that you are sharing a household with another person who's also working. So the livable wage is $13.36 as of 2020, and that amounts to $535.60 per week. Okay, poverty guidelines from 2021 in a one-person household. The poverty guidelines say you need $248 basically per week. Well, I also looked at 125% of the federal poverty level. That's about $310 per week. The Social Security Disability Insurance substantial gainful activity in 2020 for non-blind people. Blind people have a higher level. For non-blind, it's about $293. So that is right in the $300 ballpark.
And again, that's when it starts being offset. That's not when it disappears.
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
that's an important.
I think there's a 1-for-2 offset.
Yep.
Yeah. The Economic Policy Institute put out a report that looks at various changes to the UI system. And they suggested a minimum benefit of the greater of 20% of the state average weekly wage or $250. For 2020 in Vermont, the greater of 20% of the state average weekly wage or $250 turns out to be $250. Our average weekly wage is not as high as in some other places. The Hamilton project suggested 20% of the US average weekly wage, not the state average weekly wage. And that turns out to be for private sector workers in 2020, about $203.
I think it's interesting that both of those are recommending something that is below poverty essentially.
Mhm. Well, 250 is right about at
Yeah.
poverty, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to this, but is there a reason, are we just, is it the mainframe issue that prevents us from just saying, hey, why don't we just increase the benefit to everybody?
Yes, indeed.
That is in some way impossible. We've been told.
Yes, so you would do that by changing the formula. And we've been told you cannot change the formula. Pardon me.
And these changes that we're discussing now are a different piece of the formula. Is that right? I mean, they're.
So my understanding is that the formula would still do its job, would compute the average, I'm sorry, the weekly benefit amount. But somehow at the end, that amount would be overwritten with a new minimum or a new maximum. But the Department of Labor is nervous about that as well.
Yeah.
And the Department of Labor is here. Historically, they have said the formula is impossible to change, and that's been backed up by,
Yes.
PBS, but that the minimum, the maximum are possible to change. They have said that historically.
And Damien, was the last time we made any changes to the basic formula, what, 2013 or something like that?
No, it was 1986 was the last time we changed the actual weekly benefit formula. That's when we set the divisor at average of your two high quarters divided by 45. It was Section 2 of Act 146 of that year. And then before that, the last change before that was in July of 1969, before the current mainframe existed. So the current mainframe has had two formulas essentially. The one that existed before 1986 and the one that existed after, but we're looking at 35 years since the last change.
So my memory is foggy, but somewhere when we were digging out of our bankrupt state, there was the grand bargain, and we, as I recall, we created a cut to workers and an increase to employers.
Yep.
And that worked really well. And then we quickly came to a point where we decreased the tax rate for employers. And I recall because in the House, when I served them, we were saying, well, good, now we can increase benefit to workers, and that amendment failed. Then the next year, that got changed into law and workers saw a boost. So how did that happen? What?
Yeah, so the grand bargain included, so we're familiar with the revisions to the tax schedule and the taxable wage base. And those had built in sort of resets where you would hit a balance where the tax schedule could drop to Schedule 3 and you'd reduce your taxable wage base by $2,000 to provide an extra bit of tax relief to employers. The corresponding pain felt by workers was that the maximum weekly benefit was frozen at $425 until the federal loans were paid back. And then it was allowed to increase by the percentage increase in the state average weekly wage. And then I believe it was when we got to Schedule 3, but I'd have to check the language again, was when you had a reset to 57% of the state average weekly wage, because that's where it had been. Then we froze it, and then we allowed it to increase, but it was at a lower percentage of the state average weekly wage. And so it wasn't until the trust fund reached a sort of equilibrium point in our tax schedules that we allowed it to come back up. The other thing that we put in was a 1-week waiting period for benefits, which takes the first week after you're unemployed, you can't get the benefits. So that also reduced the amount that employees could get right off the bat, reduce the burden on the trust fund to speed up recovery. And that was repealed a few years later as well. But that again was sort of part of that process of digging out there.
Okay.
So
those didn't mess with the formula.
yeah,
That was just the maximum.
So we played with the maximum. What about the 57%? Are we, that we can't mess with that number? You just said that was part of the change. too.
So I think the 57% of state average weekly wage. So we calculate the state average weekly wage pursuant to a formula that's set in the unemployment law every year. And then they take 57% of that and they change the maximum within the mainframe. So that is a number, as I understand it, from the department, that we could change, because it's a number that they plug in each year after they've done the calculation.
We could change the weekly wage calculation or the 57%?
We could change the 57% potentially.
Which again is just the maximum benefit,
Yes.
not all
My-
other benefits.
My understanding, and I don't want to speak for the department, but my understanding is that 57% is calculated outside the mainframe. And then the dollar amount that they get is plugged into the mainframe as the cutoff point. So when the mainframe's doing its formula, when it hits that 583 or 513, 531 dollar amount, whatever it is for that particular year, it says, okay, you've hit the max, I can't pay you anymore. And then we added language this year that said it can't decrease. So that again supports this idea that we're calculating it outside the mainframe, and the mainframe's not doing this automatically. So, and the reason we added that was because we had such a spike in the weekly benefits or the state average weekly wage during the pandemic because of the number of low wage workers who lost their jobs, that we were worried as they came back to work, we might see a decrease, which would then see people lose benefits. So again, we basically said it freezes if there's a decrease, or it increases to 57% if there's an increase.
What helps me clarify this in my mind is that when you're talking about a percentage, you're talking about a percentage that's used to calculate the maximum benefit amount.
Mhm.
But when we're talking about the math that's applied to all beneficiaries, it's actually a divisor, not a percentage, and we just use percentage as shorthand. And it's that divisor math inside the mainframe that is not touchable and hasn't been changed since the
Okay.
80s.
Right, I think
Does that help?
a good way to think about the mainframe is it is a processor. So it takes data on the front end and it runs it through all of its gates and paths. And the 45 divisor is one of those very specific paths that figures out what your benefit is. And then the max weekly benefit, I like to think of as a gate that shuts if you get to a certain point and diverts you off that way. But that's in the programming there. The 45, the difficulty with that is, at least as the department's expressed it, is that has a lot of, that is a sort of point that almost spider webs out to all of these other points in the mainframe's formula. And it wasn't designed to be updated each year in the way the maximum weekly benefit was, because that was something that was built in there in the same way that sort of changes to the tax rate and so forth are built in to their system as something we do and update every year. So it might be best described as programming without the foresight to think, hey, maybe 35 years from now, the legislators are going to want to revisit this.
So one Second, Senator. So we have about 15 more minutes on this topic. I think you have one more slide, Joyce, and Damien, you have a few things you wanted to share with us. Remembering right or no? I miss, you don't on this.
I don't think I need to share anything.
Great.
I can wait till after the break.
Senator Strachan, you had a question.
So can we find out, or is it readily available, how many millions, when we talk about paying to workers from 2010, primarily there was the 1 week waiting period and there was the freeze on the maximum. There were also things dealing with eliminating severance pay and capping the amount of benefits you can get from what it had been overall in terms of the number of weeks or in terms of the total dollars. Can we find, and when this was done in 2010, there were projections as to how much pain it was going to cost workers. Can we in any way find out if those numbers came close to what was lost or taken from workers if we hadn't made those changes? I assume it's going to depend a lot on caseload, but I'm wondering if they have those numbers at the Department of Labor. They were able to project forward based upon assumptions, I remember, but I don't know if they can go back and say those assumptions were realized and there's, $50 million that came out of workers' pockets as a result of those changes.
So I think what you're asking for is a counterfactual to say if the changes had not been made, how much would have been spent on benefits? And given that the changes were made, how much was spent on benefits? And I think that means the Department of Labor would have to do that exercise because I have no idea what their assumptions were going into the legislation. So I think that would be a question for the Department of Labor.
Okay. I have one other question, going back to the trust fund balance. Do we have, when the S62 was passed, we were looking at not only the pain employers were expected to feel from rate shock, but also the benefit that workers would get from what we had proposed. And we felt comfortable with that because, as you said, at that point, we were like in one of the healthiest trust funds going. But things have transpired over the last year and we've seen a lot of benefits paid out. But even with those benefits being out, there was projections for 10 years forward based on certain assumptions that we would again reach a very healthy trust fund. And I'm just wondering if anything's changed. Are we still comfortable with the $300 million in savings to employers and the $100 million in increased benefits to workers? Are we still looking with those changes at a healthy trust fund?
And I think after our break, we're going to look out at the trust fund over the next 10 years to see how we might want to shift it.
Okay.
So I don't have those numbers.
Yeah.
I hope is the Department of Labor just fine or?
Yes, they're hanging out inside the Zoom room.
Okay, great. Right, so I'm trying to think about how that was projected and how we would check on those numbers. Again, I think there has to be a Vermont Department of Labor question because we did those projections. I don't think they will update those projections until their next annual report, which comes out in January.
Okay.
So they may want to defer, but yeah, I think that has to be their exercise. Okay, so our last slide.
Yeah, please do the last slide and then, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so you'll remember that I looked at both the EPI and the Hamilton project recommendation about 20% of either the state average weekly wage or the US average weekly wage as the minimum benefit amount. But it is interesting that one of them, and I can't remember which one now, one of them also suggested that during bad economic downturns, you might consider raising the minimum UI benefit to 30% of average weekly wages. So it was suggested that when you got to either 6% or 8% unemployment levels, that you go to this 30% of the average weekly wage. So just to give you an idea of the amounts there, I've shown on this chart 30% of the state average weekly wage and 30% of the US average weekly wage from 2017 to 2019. So again, you do get to about $300 a week if you use 30% of the average weekly wage for the US.
And this data point impacts our benefits just by virtue of impacting the minimum. Is that right?
Well, that's the way I've modeled it here. In fact, I think the average weekly wage figures into the maximum benefit amount. Right?
Yeah, so the formula sets the maximum benefit as 57% of the state average weekly wage as calculated based on the unemployment, taxable unemployment work. So if you're doing work that isn't covered by the unemployment system, you're not included in that calculation. So small nonprofits and that sort of thing might not be covered, aren't included, but yeah, it's you can figure out the rough state average weekly wage just by taking the max weekly benefit and dividing by 57. And that gives you the.
I'm looking, trying to find your presentation from last, but maybe I can't find it quickly. So a recipient who's in the middle, they're not maxing out, they're not at the minimum. Aren't they also getting 57% of their wage replacement?
Roughly. So if you assume that they're getting the total wages in their two highest earning quarters divided by 45, if you assume that the average week there is equal, it works out to about 57.7% after you divide by 45. So 26 weeks divided by 45 is about 57.7% of each week's wages. So it's a little bit more than that. But the difficulty with that is you don't get an exact number by using a whole number divisor. So,
Right.
Or an exact percentage.
I'm trying to think of things that we can manipulate that are outside of the sacred formula that would have an accidental impact of increasing benefits to everybody. And maybe I should stop guessing at what might work and just ask both of you, is there zero thing we can think of other than the minimum and the maximum to change in any of the inputs? I mean, what happens if we shifted to the federal weekly wage average in our law as opposed to looking at the state? That seems to look at a bigger number.
Yeah, again, and Joyce, feel free to just jump in and cut me off if I get out of my depths. But you're looking at these numbers are related to, or at least the proposals, which I'll be talking about after the break, are related to setting your max or your minimum. And then they also have graduated sort of income calculations, but that's something that we've been told we can't do with the mainframe right now. So that's the problem. We can potentially tweak wage replacement for people at the bottom of the scale by setting a floor. And we can potentially tweak it for the people who are currently maxing out by raising the ceiling and allowing more of them to receive the 57.7% wage replacement under the existing formula. The difficulty with both of those is that you don't get the people in the heart of the formula. So,
And if I could interrupt you, Damian, I think, what Joyce is offering us in these final slides is different ways of benchmarking that maximum and the minimum to something rather than picking arbitrary numbers that worked in her graphs. But in whatever we benchmark the minimum, the maximum to, which we can do in various ways in statute, the mechanical options are the minimum and maximum.
right, and we tried to do an approach that would have gotten across the board with $25 but we're all familiar with what's happened with that. So I think the challenge right now is if we can't adjust this formula that gets everyone, are there other levers that we can pull that will at least get some of the population? And I think the two that I can think of are just the minimum and maximum. The only other options are really just adding individuals who could claim UI benefits, but that's not really changing the wage replacement. It's just adding people to the pool of individuals who might be eligible. So, but that's a whole nother sort of question there. And it doesn't get at this issue of, if the wage replacement level is not appropriate, how can we get to a more appropriate level?
I would just say that within the UI system, I don't see any other levers to pull. I think if you wanted to be super creative outside the UI system, you could think about universal basic income, for example, just take everybody in the state's minimum level of subsistence.
Do we pay for that, the trust fund?
Exactly. No, right, so I don't see much more that could be done within the UI trust fund.
But even that universal income thing outside the system, we're told by the feds that we can't use trust fund dollars.
No, I'm not using
Yeah.
dollars, absolutely not.
Yeah, our use of trust fund dollars is restricted to the payment of benefits and the payment of refunds to employers who have overpaid their UI contributions. We can't use it for other purposes outside of the UI parameters. The feds don't restrict how much we set the benefit amount at. They don't have specific standards around that. They do have specific standards, though, about how we use those trust fund dollars. And so that's where we run into the challenges here. And that's why the restrictions in the mainframe become such an issue, is because the mainframe is the bottleneck right now that sort of prevents us from changing the formula for how we use those trust fund dollars. So.
Thank you.
Joyce, way back in the beginning, there was the graph of the people who are at zero. And if we wound up taking some of those people out of the zero, would that change your calculation significantly? It wasn't that many people, right?
It was about 4% of people.
Okay.
I do need to interject one thing. I did not mention that I reduced the number of people on the system down to 45% because the number of people on the system during 2020 second half was pandemic driven, was much higher than we've seen before. So I used the level from January, February 2020 and found that it was about 45% of second half of 2020. So
you
reduced the number of people.
Use the distribution that was shaped like the pandemic distribution, but you lowered it to, that makes sense to me.
Right. Right. So it would be 4.2% of the total number of people on the system that could be affected. There may be restrictions, however, because I believe penalty weeks and overpayment offsets and so forth may be set in statute or may be set by federal law. So we may not have discretion over moving those people. I don't know for sure.
Many of those people we do have discretion over. We're going to talk about it after lunch.
Okay, good. All right.
Could I just understand? You're saying 4% roughly of recipients had zero benefits.
Yes.
In 2018, did that hold? I just keep coming back to this. Why would you bother if you were getting zero benefits, except for you were getting $300 and $600?
Right, so you can see, I'm looking now at the chart that shows the distribution in 2018 versus 2020. And the orange and blue lines are a bit higher, so it looks like they might be maybe 5 or 6, maybe 6% of recipients. So a slightly larger share were at zero. It was called ineligible, but it really means zero benefit.
Oh, so they just tried.
Well, no, they were eligible. This is Department of Labor old labeling. I don't like if they changed it. So these are people who are monetarily eligible. So they had the earnings and they had all the characteristics to be eligible. But they were in penalty weeks, meaning they could not receive a dollar amount in benefits. Or they had overpayments in the past that were being run down.
I see.
So they were getting.
So this was their net for that
So
week.
the net, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Or they applied and they had severance that they're working through, but they applied and are sort of waiting for that period to end
Okay.
before their checks kick in.
So in a way, if we were to suddenly say they would get a bigger amount, there might still be categorical reasons why they wouldn't get anything.
Yes.
Thank you.
Representative Marcotte, do you have any thoughts?
Not at the moment.
Okay. I think we all need to give some thought about sort of the edges of this graph. I hear a lot of disappointment that we can't hit the middle population. I don't see how that's possibly fixable. And so how much sort of those margins on the floor, I think, are really interesting. And that how many folks we managed to rise up, despite the fact that a few people are going to be kicked over into a strange sort of category. And so I think we need to think through, I guess my question is there more we need to know to feel okay about this? Are there caveats there? Do people just want to digest those edges a little bit?
Well, I'd like to digest them and I'd like to hear from the department in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, sort of the range of, well, you can pass that law and we'll try, but versus, yes, we support this as a solution.
Mhm.
I don't know, you know, there's probably several points along the continuum, but that matters to me as I try to figure out what I like.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay. With that, thank you, Joyce. I think we're going to take a 15-minute break and come back for exactly that.